What Bolivia did today crossed a line that Chilean authorities had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Chile did not hesitate. They responded with precision, overwhelming force, and calculated restraint. For 18 months now, there had been signals. Not official statements, not formal diplomatic notes, just signals that Bolivia was preparing something unprecedented. Bolivia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Santiago this morning was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor border activity know the indicators. The increased radio chatter along the Altiplano frontier, the unusual movement of equipment near Charaña, the sudden repositioning of Bolivian units away from traditional patrol routes, the complete cessation of routine border communications, all of that went quiet. And whenever Bolivia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early this morning, Chilean border surveillance detected what they described as unauthorized military incursion, including armored vehicles that had not been deployed this far south in over 2 decades. These are the kinds of assets that Bolivia only uses when they are signaling something very specific: territorial challenge, resource claim dispute, or direct military confrontation. Chilean observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Bolivia was changing posture. And when neighboring nations shift military posture without explanation, even by small measures, Santiago pays attention. The incursion began at approximately 6:30 hours local time when Bolivian forces crossed established border markers near the Silala River region, an area that has remained contentious since the 1904 Treaty of Peace and Friendship, but had been managed through diplomatic channels for generations. What made this different was not just the crossing itself, but what crossed mechanized infantry units, mobile artillery platforms, and communications equipment designed for extended operations rather than patrol missions. The emergency directive issued by Chilean Defense Minister tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior officials after closed-door meetings described Bolivia's move as provocative, destabilizing, and perhaps most importantly, operationally significant, meaning this wasn't posturing, but intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Chile did not. In fact, their response today was among the swiftest we've seen in South American military affairs. Here's what we know. Within 4 hours of the border violation, Chile activated Operation Copper Shield. These weren't the standard border patrol reinforcements. These were full mechanized divisions, forces that Chile only deploys when they are preparing to defend territorial sovereignty at scale. The 1st Armored Division moved from their base in Antofagasta toward the border region, while the 3rd Mountain Infantry Brigade repositioned from Calama to establish defensive positions along the international boundary. Tonight, Defense Ministry sources confirmed that Chilean forces launched containment operations on multiple fronts, including the Silala River crossing that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was exactly this scenario. Chile positioned before Bolivia could establish operational footholds. They secured the primary crossing points. They established observation posts on elevated terrain. They deployed mobile artillery units that were likely preparing to support defensive operations. In other words, Chile targeted Bolivia's ability to sustain the incursion, the logistics infrastructure that would have made it operational. This is what made Santiago's warning so urgent. Bolivia's move wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of territorial challenge that could escalate beyond diplomatic resolution if left unchecked. And Chile, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't cross into Bolivian territory. They didn't target Bolivian installations beyond the border. They secured Chilean sovereign territory. They established defensive superiority along the contested boundary. The Chilean response included deployment of the Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks, equipment that hasn't been moved to the northern border region since the water rights tensions of 2016. These are not patrol vehicles. They are designed for sustained territorial defense operations. Additionally, Chilean Air Force F-16 Fighting Falcons began continuous combat air patrols over the border region, while ground-based air defense systems were repositioned to provide coverage over critical infrastructure and population centers. And here's where the story becomes even more concerning. Intelligence sources now believe that Bolivia's latest move was designed to test the resolve of Chilean defense policy after recent domestic political pressures in Santiago. Bolivia wanted to see whether Chile would respond weakly, but instead, the opposite happened. Chilean leadership didn't hesitate. They deployed forces that were so overwhelming, so precisely positioned that even La Paz noticed. You don't get Bolivia's attention easily, but today, Chile did. Military analysts speaking with regional media under anonymity described Bolivia's shift as probing, a way to assess Chilean readiness and resolve. But Chile proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their troop movements were not only swift, they were positioned so precisely that Bolivia's own forces found themselves tactically disadvantaged within hours of their initial crossing. That positioning matters because it shows strategic depth. It shows that Chile is not simply reacting to border incidents. They are maintaining operational superiority. The speed of Chile's response suggests contingency planning that goes back months, possibly years. The fact that mechanized divisions could be repositioned and deployed within hours indicates that Santiago has been preparing for exactly this scenario, despite public diplomatic assurances about peaceful border management. As reports continued coming in throughout the afternoon, we learned more about the scale of Chile's response. The 1st Armored Division carried out rapid deployment operations, forcing Bolivia to pause their advance within the contested zone. Chilean artillery units targeted observation positions that had been established in the last 72 hours. Special operations forces operating near Olague reportedly interdicted communications equipment used by Bolivia to coordinate the incursion. This wasn't just border reinforcement. This wasn't just defensive positioning. This was territorial dominance. This was operational control. And operational control is the one thing Bolivia has struggled to maintain since their inland geography limited their strategic options. For every advance they have made, Chile has countered with something that complicates Bolivia's position. The deployment included not just combat units, but the entire logistics infrastructure necessary for sustained operations, field hospitals, communications networks, supply chains, and engineering units capable of rapidly improving defensive positions. Remember, Bolivia thought Chile's recent domestic political transitions meant military readiness would be compromised. They thought international attention focused elsewhere would provide operational space. They thought the rainy season would limit Chile's ability to rapidly reposition forces. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Chile's response has been faster than Bolivia anticipated. Chile's force deployment has been more comprehensive than regional analysts predicted. Chile's tactical positioning has isolated Bolivia's forward elements. What makes this moment so dangerous and so unpredictable is that Bolivia's latest move happened at a time when President Luis Arce is under intense domestic pressure. Economic nationalists want more aggressive resource claims. Military hardliners want territorial assertion. Diplomatic moderates want negotiated resolution. Popular movements want visible action against Chilean influence. Arce is balancing these demands while managing Bolivia's landlocked strategic limitations. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The timing coincides with Bolivia's ongoing economic challenges and the approaching anniversary of the 1904 treaty that cost Bolivia its Pacific coastline, a date that regularly inflames nationalist sentiment and creates political pressure for any Bolivian government. Chilean President Gabriel Boric's emergency statement, now circulating through diplomatic channels, was designed to signal that Chile is not willing to allow territorial sovereignty to be tested through military action. Defense officials said plainly that Bolivia's incursion was inconsistent with international law and bilateral agreements. That is diplomatic language for this ends now or we escalate further. You don't usually hear that tone from Santiago unless something serious is at stake. The statement also referenced Chile's commitment to defending territorial integrity through all necessary means, language that diplomatic observers recognize as authorization for expanded military action if the situation deteriorates. Meanwhile, Chile's defense minister addressed the nation in a measured, forceful speech tonight. She said, Chilean territory is not negotiable through military action. She said, our response has been proportional but decisive. And she said, we remain committed to peace but prepared for any scenario. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from leadership that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Bolivia's latest move wasn't isolated. Along with the border incursion, Bolivian naval forces also increased activity on Lake Titicaca. Military communications increased coordination with allied units. Bolivia enhanced surveillance operations targeting Chilean border infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 48-hour period. When Bolivia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. The coordination suggests this was planned operation rather than opportunistic probing, which increases the likelihood that Bolivia has additional moves prepared depending on Chilean response. Military analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Bolivia is preparing to claim water rights through territorial assertion. Another is that Bolivia is attempting to force renegotiation of border agreements through controlled escalation. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Bolivia is attempting to create a new territorial reality before international intervention. But today, Chile took that card off the table. They didn't file diplomatic protests. They didn't request international mediation. They didn't issue warnings. They deployed divisions. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Bolivia wants to see whether territorial assertion will be met with military resistance. Chile wants to show that sovereignty is non-negotiable. Regional powers want to prevent escalation into wider conflict, and international observers want to prevent territorial disputes from destabilizing South American security. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring communications between military commands. They say Bolivia has not withdrawn from occupied positions. They say Chilean forces continue to strengthen defensive positions. And they say Bolivia's decision to maintain the incursion is likely part of broader strategy intended to force Chilean concessions on resource access. But Chile is not negotiating under military pressure. In fact, Chile is escalating defensive preparations. Their response today, swift, overwhelming, and strategically sound, sent a message to Bolivia that territorial challenges will be met with military resistance. And it sent a message to regional powers that Chile remains committed to maintaining territorial integrity. As the evening continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Bolivia hoped to achieve. But what we do know is that Chile's response was decisive. It established military superiority. It prevented Bolivia from consolidating territorial gains. And it demonstrated that Chilean sovereignty is defended by more than diplomatic protests. What happens next will depend on what Bolivia does in the next 24 hours. If they withdraw, this moment will be remembered as successful deterrence. If they escalate, Chilean forces have already shown they are positioned for sustained defensive operations. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in decades, Bolivia appears to be calculating. La Paz is quiet, too quiet. And when Bolivia is quiet, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Bolivia learned something they have learned many times before. Chilean military readiness is not symbolic. Chilean territorial defense is not negotiable. And Chilean response is not hesitant. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Chile will defend its territory. Bolivia must decide how far they're willing to push. And South America is watching to see whether territorial disputes will be resolved through diplomacy or force. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.